Thank back to the graph. Perfect. Versus the majority of people here said maybe some versus only 33%. So more skeptics, I believe, than in this room than we see at the national data. But that's a little taste of the data that we're going to get into today. A little bit about us. I'm Melanie Phillips. I'm the head of the analyst team and run our internal research. We have with us Sumati Thomas, who was a contributor and leader on this poll, also leads a lot of our media and research communications on the team. Presenting today is going to be Stephen Claremont, who's our head of polling and the driver of the insights. And our CEO, Mike Greenfield, can't be here today, but is with us in spirit as he's off working and continuing our research in other sectors. So a little bit about Change Research. If you don't know who we were founded in 2017 to democratize access to public opinion research and make the world more humane, scientific, and just. We also have another wing called Embold Research, launched in 2021 to help leaders understand what people want and need outside of just political work. Our results are based off of a dynamic online sampling that finds people where they're at. I don't know about you, but I'm not answering the door to take surveys and I don't even own a landline. So things have changed and our methodology meets that. We also have a couple different products offerings, Spark, which is a candidate viability rapid response poll, Magnify AI, which we use a little bit in here for custom modeling to look at different types of profiles of potential conspiracy believers, and Voices, which is our qualitative research. All of this has given us an incredible amount of data. We have a wealth of data that, as a data nerd myself, makes it incredible, the insights that we can pull that we're sharing a little bit with you today. And all of this comes from our Compass polls. These are polls that we run a couple times a month, and you can get access to the data if you want through our portal, which is an AI-supported and powered data portal that allows you to analyze millions of responses in seconds, allows you to ask real-time questions to real data collected by Change senior pollsters, and can engage in Q&As and discussions like this. So if you're interested, you can email us at subscription@changeresearch.com or go to our website. Okay, enough of me giving the spiel. I can now hand it over to the real reason why we're all here today to hear Stephen's insights about this poll.
Thank you, Melanie. And just want to start out with a brief look at the methodology of this poll. Like we said, it's 1,590 voters nationwide and is balanced on gender, age, race, education, region, party, and urbanicity. And the results we're going to look at have a margin of error of 2.6 percentage points. So just starting with the background, like why we thought about doing this poll and sort of what it is that we were trying to measure and figure out, which basically comes down to I and people in our company, and I'm sure a lot of you are political science majors as undergrads or have advanced degrees. And one of the things that I know my first class in American politics way back in 1989 focused on work by Richard Hofstadter, in particular the paranoid style. And he defines conspiratorial thinking in a variety of different ways: an apocalyptic sense of struggle, conspiratorial worldview, exaggerated perception of threat, personalization of conflict, style of overinterpretation, sort of random facts woven into elaborate patterns, defensive aggressiveness, the thinker feeling dispossessed, cheated, or victimized, and notes, as we'll go through this, the style recurs throughout American history, especially in times of social stress. So why would we think in the year 2025 that looking at this decades-old writing would be relevant? And I think you can look at some examples of a leader, particularly the one that's been sort of dominating the globe's political life for the last 10 years. And you can see in the president's sort of presentation that all of these fit. Apocalyptic sense of struggle. I think we need to go over to Truth Social to see a lot of examples of that. Saying things like Joe Biden is being controlled by people you've never heard of, people are in the shadows, that we need to take out ISIS family members. Democratic lawmakers who don't applaud me, that's treasonous, and a lot of defensive aggressiveness in both his time in public life as president, as a candidate, as a criminal defendant, as a defendant in civil suits. See this over and over and over again. And I will say that this is not like, this presentation is not about like Donald Trump or RFK or current members of the administration being like, they're the ones that amplify paranoid thinking. It is endemic throughout politics and throughout history. And that's what we'll sort of get to. But this sort of genesis of why we did this survey, and I think we timed it, started thinking about and drafting it right when the Jeffrey Epstein story reemerged into public consciousness in a major way and has not disappeared. And then just sort of looking at examples of just like how what we're talking about is not new. Joe McCarthy in the 50s makes speeches about how our present situation is a product of a great conspiracy so immense that it dwarfs any previous venture in the history of man. Conspiracy of infamy so black that when it's exposed, the principles will be deserving of scorn. But if you go back, look at the Populist Party in the 19th century, like their platform is as early as 1865, a conspiracy was entered between the gold gamblers of Europe and America. Every device of treachery are being used to deal a blow to the prosperity of the people. Right within a decade of the writing of the US Constitution, a major work at the time alleged that the Illuminati infiltrated Freemasonry and fueled it to eradicate Christianity, fueled revolutions across the world and sowing chaos, and how all the Masons are trying to overturn governments everywhere. Also in the 19th century, one of the most popular books in the first part of the 19th century was a book called Awful Disclosures by Maria Monk, which supposedly looked at her time in a convent where she claimed that nuns would baptize children, strangle them, and throw them in pits and cover them with lime. This was the most popular book in the 19th century until the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and was shown that the whole thing was a fake. She never visited a convent, exhibited severe mental illness, and then had a untimely demise. And this is just examples of this throughout American history. We don't look into Catherine the Great and her horse and different conspiracies that have been throughout the entire globe over centuries. I think America is hard enough to try to figure out. So getting into, when we're sort of thinking about this and deconstructing what this sort of belief in conspiracies come from, and what we'll see in the poll and what we see in data over time is a fundamental this flourishes when there's a fundamental distrust in government. And this is one of the central things in public opinion of different measures that people look at in terms of trust. This is from Gallup, and they report every year people's trust in the federal government on domestic problems. And as you can see, there was generally trust in the 1990s, and it spiked after 9/11 and gradually declined through the aughts. It was sort of mixed and middling during the financial crisis. But since the mid part of the last decade, consistently every year, majorities do not trust the federal government when it handles domestic problems, and that has not changed with administration. Same thing with international problems. It's not quite as deep. But what sort of existed in the shock after 9/11 gradually wore off, and we're in a period of profound distrust. And I will note, we'll see this on this next slide, this goes back to the 50s and the American National Election Studies. Just agreement with public officials, don't care much about what people like me think. This gradually grew. The period after World War II in the 50s and early 60s was a relative period of trust. And then gradually people believed that public officials didn't care about them. It grew during the 90s. But in the 2002 study, it largely fell to just 31%. And I think the important thing as we go through this is there's never a time in public opinion when things are fixed or that it's not dynamic. And that big events that shake us out of sort of one way of thinking in one era and going to another can have large effects on public opinion in really profound ways. 9/11 was definitely one of that. And I will say the person I worked with at the time in governance studies at the Brookings Institution was like this great fear that we had this spike in trust and that it was gradually being blown. And I think it's the, let's go back and look at domestic problems. It's George Bush had the benefit of the doubt after 9/11, and he and his team like decided to move into a different direction in terms of fighting the war in Iraq and cutting taxes on dividends and capital gains, where there was a way to change people's perceptions of the federal government in a way that would build trust. And as we can see, sort of the history of the 21st century so far is that has not happened. And I'll just sort of say as we go through this, like my personal bias is that I believe that the federal government and government should function well, should deliver for the people, and that the people fundamentally trust it. And efforts to undermine that trust from the left and the right are ultimately going to prevent that ideal from happening. So when I'm talking about sort of the ideal, that is my personal ideal about how government should perform and how people should react to government and the people who work for government. That's not just because my wife is a federal employee, but the more that we undermine that, the more it's going to be harder to actually get to the point of trust that we need to do to build structures and institutions that really deliver for is all individuals. So led by our data team, Evan McNeil in particular, is we took the data from the poll and asked them, can you split this into different groups based on how they respond to the questions of trust and different conspiracies that people believe in, and came back with three groups. And I think for this poll in particular, it's more valuable to sort of group people and examine people by groups like this, by like how they respond to the questions that we asked, as opposed to different demographic groups. Because if different demographic groups are going to be influenced by general sort of like partisanship and other factors, and we just sort of want to look at like how people respond to things in different ways. So we have what we call the deep believers. It's 36% of the electorate. They have the highest conspiracy beliefs across all dimensions, low trust in all institutions, including scientists, and a high belief in personal conspiracy. They're the most alienated and suspicious segment. We sort of look at it, it is 77% identify as Republicans. This group is older, like majority are over the age of 50. It is the whitest of groups. It is the highest share of evangelical Protestants, regularly pray, only 22% live in rural areas, and 31% have graduated from college. The next group that we look at are sort of moderate skeptics, moderate conspiracy beliefs, moderate trust levels among most institutions, highest overall trust in government and media, and have a balanced perspective on most issues. And we'll see that a lot of these cases that this group differs from the other groups substantially. And this group leans more Republican than Democrat. It is older, it is less white than the deep believers. 41% graduated from college. It is fairly religious, but not quite as religious as the other group. And then the selective conspiracy believers they also exhibit high conspiracy beliefs. They have a moderate distrust of institutions, very low trust in government and media, but high trust in scientists. When you sort of look at like their beliefs, they're very similar to the deep believers, even though that their politics and religion and that they're younger are radically different. They just trust scientists while the other group doesn't, but they have similar levels of distrust in government, in corporations and business, and in the media. So at the beginning, we assess the truthfulness of various statements. Um, as you can see, like when I do these heat maps, the blue here is the deeper the blue, the stronger the like agreement, and or stronger the truth. And the redder, which in this case, people generally agree, believe these statements to be true across the board, um, is the more sort of split belief. And the thing across all these groups is the belief that many very important things happen in the world that the public is never informed about, and that politicians do not tell us the true motives for the decisions. There's a little more split on government agencies monitoring all citizens. There are forces out there that are conspiring against people like me, which I crafted out of an old Mark Maron joke about being a paranoid agnostic, that I don't believe in God, but there's a force out there, and it's acting against me. That the deep believers largely believe that's true. All politicians are corrupt, which I'll note the selective believers believe that's true, almost to the level of deep believers, as opposed to the moderate skeptics. There is a big difference on events which superficially seem to lack a connection are often the result of secret activities. The deep believers and moderate skeptics are more likely to believe that's true, and the selective believers are split. There's sort of an ubiquity of paranoid thinking when it comes to politics and media. All voters, particularly the deep believers, believe that at least very or somewhat often major news stories are deliberately suppressed or hidden from the public. Very likely to believe that powerful people work together in secret to shape major political or economic events, and that when there are conflicting accounts of the same event, people often believe that powerful people are trying to hide the truth. And when we look at trust, this is where you see the real differences between these groups. The deep believers pretty much distrust everybody except family and friends. That's the one group that people universally trust, no matter what group they belong in. The moderate skeptics, and particularly selective believers, have a very, very high trust in scientists and academic researchers, while the deep believers do not. Also, the skeptics and selective believers believe in online independent journalists and bloggers more than the deep believers, but the selective believers do trust independent journalists more than they do the traditional news media. But when we look at members of Congress, the federal government, social media platforms, and large corporations and companies, there's a very, very significant distrust with both the selective believers, the more Democratic-leaning group, and the deep believers, the more Republican-leaning group. Selective believers more likely to distrust religious leaders, but that is also true with deep believers, despite how religious they are. And the one group, the moderate skeptics, are most questioning are of social media platforms. And I think for us, in terms of thinking as a democratic strategist, and where I think our future research is going to go on this, is as TV ads for candidates migrate from television to digital, is there an effect by being on the medium of social media when you see an ad that's similar to what would be broadcast on television? Do people distrust that more when they see it on social media versus television, because they're already conditioned to be skeptical of everything that they see on social media? And are we deliberately making our ads less persuasive as we go to digital? And do we need a completely different approach in what we're talking about and how we're narrating government when we are running digital ads versus television? Those are the biggest questions I have from going through this research. When the trust in actors in the best interest of average Americans, there's even more distrust pretty much of everybody, but you can see the large split with scientists among the selective believers and the deep believers, and but sort of the left and right groups coming together on members of Congress, federal government, social media platforms, and large companies. So we asked people some statements about events that and whether they believe to be true or not, where there's some question. By a conspiracy theory in this poll, we mean a belief that secret or influential individual organization is responsible for an event or phenomenon. And our focus really is how widely held and what they reveal about the public trust. And some of these, like the CIA has been involved in assassinating foreign leaders. That is something that is at different times in history that's been disputed, but that is largely proven to have happened. Um, and people across the board believe that US leaders have excused human rights abuses by foreign governments to protect political or business interests. I will note that across the board, deep believers, moderate skeptics, and selective believers all believe that it's more likely true than false that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered to protect powerful people. But also, people believe across the board that mainstream media takes orders from powerful elites about what stories to cover, phenomenon that's getting worse as we see large news organizations being concentrated and sold to very wealthy individuals. Large belief that elite child trafficking networks catering to wealthy pedophiles operate with impunity. Pharmaceutical companies suppress cures for diseases to maintain profits. The deep believers are more belief that the CIA has been involved in assassinating American political figures than the rest, but still people are more likely to be true or not. Where the selective believers really differ from everyone else are stuff that's deliberately coded in modern partisan politics. The term deep state is coded really as these voters see that phrase as something that a Trump related phrase that they don't believe that the deep state actively works to undermine elected officials. They don't believe that COVID-19 was deliberately created in a laboratory. They don't believe the Capitol riot was instigated by government agents. I think we can probe that further. Of government agents is a broad term that could encompass lots of different theories about what happened on January 6th, and that do not believe that big tech companies secretly coordinate to silence conservative voices. By small margins, people do believe, more likely true than not, that alien life has reached the Earth many times. The stuff that voters overall believe is not true. Across the board, people don't believe that the Earth is flat, by and large. Some who do, or at least say that they do in this poll, and that birds aren't real and actually government surveillance drones. But most people believe that birds are real. A little more of a difference between these groups on the moon landing never happened. But the deep believers are more likely than not to believe that mass shootings have been staged to end the Second Amendment, that most sporting events are fixed for certain teams to win, which also might be true if you go back and look at the fourth quarter of the 2010 NBA Finals between the Lakers and Celtics. That was definitely fixed. The government is seeding clouds of chemicals to control the weather. Climate change is a hoax. Vaccines contain dangerous ingredients. Most elections are hacked. The 2020 presidential election was stolen through systemic fraud. The Federal Reserve is controlled by foreign interests. And interestingly, the 9/11 terrorist attacks involved some level of government foreknowledge or involvement, which I think in 2001, if you sort of showed this dynamic, people wouldn't have believed it. But as we found, tested this 4 years ago in a poll where we were looking deep into Republican voters. I sort of heard this belief at the time, which I was sort of shocking as someone who was working in professional polling and politics on 9/11, is that Republican voters are now split on whether the deep state duped George W. Bush on WMDs in Iraq and led him into wars that we never should have been part of, and we need to stand up to the deep state, versus after 9/11, George W. Bush did the right thing, fighting the war on terror. We need leaders to protect America and lead the global fight against terrorism. And younger Republican men are the most likely to believe that the deep state duped George W. Bush on WMDs in Iraq. And it's very, again, it just sort of shows that stories and narratives in people's heads history can be shaped, and history is being shaped, particularly in these events, all the time. And stories that would be that you wouldn't think that you could question, certainly right after 9/11, where if you weren't wearing an American flag suit and it's shouting America's great to your top of your lungs, you'd be looked as a terrorist sympathizer. That can be completely different 25 years later. People think and believe stories, and the stories that they think and believe are constantly shaped all the time. So we asked people why people don't admit to believing in conspiracy theories and gave people some options. The deep believers, they're much more likely than others to say that they don't admit to believing these things because they don't believe most people are open to hearing it. They're also most likely to say, I'm not embarrassed, I share these things openly, as opposed to selective believers and moderate skeptics who don't, they hear things that seem real to them, like the 2010 NBA finals were fixed for the Lakers. They don't necessarily talk about it because they're not completely sure that it's true. Also don't want to get into arguments, or selective believers, even though they do, they show that they did in the previous questions, say they don't believe in what are defined as conspiracy theories. From an historical perspective, and this gets back at trust in government and the problems with the lack of trust in government, is that most people believe that there are historical events where the FBI's or CIA's real role is still not public. I think, as we'll show a little bit later, elite opinion does matter on some of these things. When we ask why do you think the JFK or RFK or MLK assassination files were recently released, the deep believers are much more likely to say that they're released for good reasons as opposed to bad reasons. And selective believers feel the opposite way. The selective believers are most likely to believe that this is to detract from other political issues, while deep believers believe that this is done to increase transparency and public trust. As Melanie said, when UFOs and alien life, overall, 32% believe that the government is definitely keeping evidence of UFOs or alien life secret. 33% say keeping some evidence secret. Only 18% say that they're not, which is a very, very low percentage. That's true across all of these different groups. And another 17% are not sure. And people believe in UFOs or alien life because they're unexplained sightings or videos. This was certainly prevalent in New Jersey in December, where no one could explain the drones that were randomly flying overhead. The selective believers are more likely to say that desire for hope and excitement about the unknown, and about a quarter think that the government is just lying to us. Now, getting to Jeffrey Epstein, which is one of the reasons why we thought about doing this poll, is back in March when this was not in the news, a couple months before the DOJ came out and saying that there's nothing to see here, move on. 84% of voters believe that the Department of Justice has released all the files relating to Jeffrey Epstein. 88% believe that it's important for the government to release all these files, and 93% believe it's important that political figures or elites connected to Jeffrey Epstein face further investigation regardless of their party affiliation. And there is no partisan difference on any of these questions overall, both between Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and then with Republicans, those who explicitly identify as MAGA versus the ones who don't. And then looking at this poll, it's 63% of voters overall believe he is murdered. Only 14% believe the story, or what we've officially been told, that he committed suicide in prison. And the deep believers and the selective believers about equally believe he was murdered. The moderate skeptics, also a plurality, agree he was murdered. 24% believe they committed suicide, 22% not sure. Moderate believers are most likely to say that the DOJ's actions were to shut down or quiet conspiracy theories, while the deep believers, selective believers, believe that it's done to protect certain individuals. And like I said, and sort of the next slide, when we talk about government agents taking over cities, the deep believers, they take elite cues on some issues, but they do not take them on Jeffrey Epstein. And we asked a question of, do you support or oppose the government deploying troops or federal agents in cities under the Home Rule Act if it's a serious threat to public safety? If you sort of look to the left here, that ad, what's the first step to a police state, is from an NRA ad several years ago. As you can see, sort of the government agents marching in the troops marching in the street. That's supposedly what the NRA was founded to try to stop. And you also sort of look at the conspiracy theory that was in Texas in 2014, which I still don't quite understand, about government military training exercises, Jade Helm. Now that this is a very clearly polarized issue, 87% of the deep believers perfectly fine with deploying federal troops under the Home Rule Act. Selective believers do not. And I will say the moderate skeptics also support deploying these troops. This is a question where you sort of ask it in different ways, but the concept of this is not something that's inherently opposed, especially by the ones with high degrees of paranoid and conspiratorial thinking. The deep believers also do not believe that if a U.S. leader used troops to arrest or detain political opponents or carry out mass surveillance in neighborhoods, 19% say there would be an unnecessary use of government power, 23% acceptable in extreme situations, and only 35% see it as either a serious violation of democracy or moving towards authoritarian rule, while the selective believers definitely see that. And this is one of the questions that is, it's elite, power of elite persuasion works, and that public opinion changes over time. That sort of, you describe the current state of what exists now in Washington, D.C. and is being threatened in other states. If it was being threatened in Houston in 2014, these results would be considerably different. So in terms of how do we talk about problems with government agencies, or when things happen, bad things happen, what do people find as a persuasive response? So we tested this different responses in different ways. And as you can see, like each one of these responses, the first one that people find most persuasive is sometimes we don't have all the answers, and I won't pretend that we do, but I'll be transparent about what we know, what we don't know, and what we're going to do to find solutions, is a powerful message across the board. It is what government officials should be saying in times of serious stress. The things that also are persuasive across the board, but I would argue are going to have potential other effects, are that powerful interests prevent real reform from happening. The system works fine for those with money and connections, but it's designed to benefit insiders at our expense. And that there are deliberate efforts to maintain the status quo. Some people in government don't want things to improve because they profit from the current broken system. And I think it's important we sort of realize that there's no real penalty for conspiratorial thinking, whether it's coming from Republicans or conservatives, or from Democrats or liberals or progressives. Like, each base are going to be open to those explanations. But I would argue from like the perspective of us wanting a functional and healthy federal government that's respected and trusted, the more that we use messaging that feeds into larger distrust of government, the harder it's going to be able to make the type of reforms that we need and to build trust in government, if what we're doing is undermining is people aren't necessarily going to hear the differences between like the Trump federal government versus the federal is corrupt versus the federal government is corrupt. And the more that we say that and reinforce that, the harder it's going to be to actually have a successful democratic administration. I think the response that is most polarizing is when we get into money. Government agencies are overwhelmed and understaffed. We have good people trying their best in a complex system, but they need more resources and better coordination to serve effectively. That is something that selective believers respond to at a very high level, and deep believers reject, and the moderate skeptics are even on. Again, it's just like transparency and telling stories of transparency and what are you doing to be transparent are what our leaders need to focus on if we're going to build a healthier country and a healthier democracy. We also tested some statements about a recent example of a recent government failure. Deep believers really respond to this happen because the agency's been captured by interests that don't prioritize public safety. People making decisions care more about politics than protecting citizens. The selective believers also respond to that message. Um, a little bit less with the deep believers, but with the moderate skeptics respond to this happened because different agencies weren't communicating effectively. We have people working hard, but the systems broke down. We need to fix the structural problems. But I think the other conspiratorial argument, which people do find persuasive, is another one potentially undermine long-term goals of a healthier government, which is this happened because there are people within government who wanted this response to fail. Some officials deliberately slow walk disaster response when it might make their political opponents look good. What is the most polarizing, but works the most with selective believers, is this happened because Congress hasn't provided adequate funding for emergency response. When you cut budgets and staffs, you can't expect the same level of service. I think it's the only way that we're going to sort of get past this era and sort of build a country post-Trump is going to be radical transparency and telling better stories about why things happen and include people more in what the solutions are going to be. And then finally, sort of in terms of candidate preferences, across the board, people prefer candidates who are outsiders to the political establishment. This is true. Deep believers strongly agree with this, and selective believers are a little bit sort of softer on this, but it is an important, people do want outsiders, and outsiders are going to have more credibility to reform government. It is what Donald Trump has been successful at. People do, particularly the moderate skeptics and selective believers, believe that if a leader says that sometimes thing goes wrong because of mistakes, not because someone is pulling the strings, they're going to find that believable. And even the deep believers, they're more split on this and they don't strongly believe this. But this is an argument that is something that we can say that's not going to inherently be polarizing or people are going to reject. And most people do believe that it'd be very effective if politicians were more transparent and acknowledging when they don't have complete information about events. It is very important to voters that candidates share their views about who really controls the government. That is something important to talk about, and it's an important narrative, regardless of whether you're telling a theory that secret people are controlling the government or that it's other alternatives. It's important to really talk about power and control and setting what you think is the narrative when running for office. Particularly the deep believers are motivated by candidates who will investigate and expose the truth about government corruption. They respond to that with a much stronger level, more motivated to vote for a candidate who says that than the selective believers. But it is important when we're talking about corruption, it's corruption by specific individuals and telling those stories and not feeding into the larger belief that government is corrupt and hopeless. And as you can see, when you use coded language like deep state or establishment influence, the deep believers are more likely to vote for someone who's talking about the deep state or establishment influence, and the selective believers say less likely. There are ways and words and descriptions to talk about things that are going to bring these different groups together. And then the more coded it is to Trump, the more divisive it's going to be and the less anyone's going to hear what you're saying. And then finally, looking into news sources, the moderate skeptics are most likely by considerable margin to get their news from local TV news. It is still an important medium to get covered and to try to get messages amplified. They are less likely than the deep believers, the selective believers, to get news online. Fox News is a main source for deep believers. Facebook is a big source also for the moderate skeptics, even though I believe that when they see stuff on Facebook, they are going to trust it less. And then local newspapers, moderate skeptics and selective believers. People are about on YouTube at similar levels, which is a haven for conspiratorial thinking. And national newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, that is what the selective believers read far more than people in the other groups. We'll also notice that deep believers are by far and away the largest Joe Rogan listeners, which is also becoming a lot of their media is self-repeating, self-reinforcing loop on that conspiracies largely to explain why things happen the way that they do. But people also do crave independent online sources. That is true of the selective believers and deep believers, that they see different versions. They're going to more likely trust something that's independent. We saw that in a lot of the one-on-one voices interviews that we do with voters that Melanie talked about at the beginning. Is hear a lot about how much people don't trust anything that they read and they want to look to multiple different news sources. Things that appear to be independent and without bias is what people are looking for. And I think a lot of our groups, I think a big part of advocacy now has to be established an online media arm that provides clear information about the issues that you're advocating for and present them in the most neutral way to get past people's filters. Mainstream news outlets, the deep believers don't really look to them at all to settle disputes. Selective believers a little bit more, but not nearly as much as something that's perceived as independent. All these groups are more likely, majorities closely follow alternative independent media and believe that it's very important to get news from sources that challenge mainstream views or narratives. And it's sort of the longer term challenge that we're going to have is to both, how do we get information to people that they will see and to believe? And I think we're going to have to be a lot more creative and in doing so. So finally, in wrapping up, people respond to stories. In an environment of deep distrust, bad actors telling compelling and untrue tales can win the narrative without effective counters. But the effective counters also have to be interesting and compelling. Nothing in our current moment is new, and that events in history are constantly being shaped by other factors and other forces. Paranoid thinking erodes trust in government, and we have to be really deliberate in our messages and what we're saying, and saying it in ways that are not ultimately going to make our larger goals harder to achieve, and that we need to do a lot more studying on digital advertising and whether the medium is polluting the message in a way that television, radio, and direct mail are not. And would love to take any questions.
Amazing. Oh, Sumani, go for it.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. First one is from Matt Poundstone. He asks, do you break down the selective believers by ideological camps, not just partisanship? For example, a lot of these belief patterns that are identified with Democrats seem more consistent with people that might call themselves populist, progressive, DSA, or factions like that.
Yes. We've been experimenting with an ideology question. I believe we used it in New York and some other places. That the traditional ideology question that's been asked for decades and decades has been, do you identify as liberal, moderate, conservative? And at Change Research, we added progressive to that to separate progressives from liberals. And you can see real differences, particularly with younger voters and what they identify with. And I think we didn't do this. I think we had sort of a more restrictive list here. But I think in other future polls, and certainly when Samadi looks more at social media usage later this year, we want to look at those patterns, because you're right. Like, there are real differences in people who define themselves as DSA versus progressive versus populist versus liberal. The same thing with people who identify as conservative, MAGA, traditional Republican, libertarian.
Another question we have from someone is, did you specify what type of religious leaders you meant in any of the questions. I'm really surprised that deep believers were skeptical of religious leaders.
No, we did not. And I think that's a good question because I think we've seen this in some work we've done recently in Oklahoma on Bibles in public schools. And one of the big arguments that works the best of why to oppose it with the sort of most evangelical audience in the state was that if you mandate this religious instruction, it's going to lead to mandating religious instruction for all religions. And I think it's a very good point about being sort of vague in religious leaders, because people are hearing, I think what they're responding to is religious leaders who are outside of my particular church and denomination. And I think if we had split that, you would see the deep believers believe the person that I see talking to me about religion, and I don't trust anyone else. But when you look them when you sort of lump them together, that someone being a religious leader outside of your own faith is not something that people inherently trust. But it's something that is worthy of more exploration.
We have another question from Matt Poundstone. Has anyone probed whether Republicans have entertained the thought that Bush was just a terrible president, or does it break down between the deep state dupe, which is Trump coded, or being a hero?
I don't think anyone. We've looked at this in a variety of ways. I think we did a big poll on 9/11 of this time about 4 years ago. It's people forget this. Bush left office deeply unpopular. I think it was like a 25% job approval rating. I think there were some that were low in the low teens. So by the time we got to end of Bush, like Republicans were split on him, and there was a narrative of that it's just like, well, it was because of the deep spending, all the spending that he did. And then sort of his withdrawal from public life as quickly as it was made it easier to sort of morph into the Tea Party. And then we saw during the primary in 2016 when Donald Trump in debates would say that Bush knew about 9/11 and knew that WMDs were fake. Like people thought that people would reject that. And then he ended up winning South Carolina, going away. The sort of belief of Bush as the sort of powerful strong man has been sort of, I think, been gone for about 20 years. What surprised me is that it took longer for perceptions of whether Iraq and Afghanistan were worth it. But by the time we got to the 2020s, like predominantly is like believed that they were not worth it. And this started spreading online, which is that Bush was duped. That was a very convenient story that when Rush Limbaugh and others started saying it, that was to be believed. And I mean, I believe I didn't put an image in here of it, although I thought about it. It's like Tucker Carlson is launching sort of this massive media campaign on sort of that 9/11, going into every single 9/11 conspiracy theory that the government knew, that the government planned it, that the government was in on it, all of it.
We have another question from Ella. Said that the recommended explanation of problems with government agencies is really from a hypothetical candidate. What is a recommendation or recommended messaging for someone who wouldn't be considered an insider or someone with power, like a 501c3 or C4? How do we talk about this as someone who doesn't have the power that a candidate would?
I think that's another very good question. It's kind of a cliche to sort of lead with your values, but like I think it's leading with your values, but it's also developing a narrative of like what you as your organization see as who has power, how they got it, and why. And I think the part of like the stories that you need to tell are like why things happen the way they do, and then how you believe that they should happen. And I'll give you sort of an example of just like, I think the Democratic Party believes like sort of the story, like the FDR story of, okay, I agree with you, now make me do it. And that power comes from people and people banding together and then overcoming obstacles to get government to respond to them. And then that power reinforces more power. I think that's a harder story to tell. Not sure it kind of works that way, but I would say as a 501c3 or C4, it's to be very clear in your goals as it relates to how the government should function. And as much as like the issues that you believe in, really think through about like how the process of that is going to work and what the benefits of that would be. Like, I think a lot of times we think we need to dumb down things for audiences, but in actual, like, I think like the detail is important, especially if it can be conveyed very simply and understandably. I think is significant, but also it's just like how we think the government should work and how that can be achieved should be part of any issue advocacy that we do. I
And
think
I
it
think
was like sorry, Samani, I'll just pontificate a little bit more. Like a few years ago, I was at this briefing, and this lobbyist for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities was talking about like even if your issue is not budget and tax, you have to be talking about budget and tax because budget and tax, it influences everything that relates to your issue. And I think the same thing sort of applies to like how we think government should work is we have to have a clear vision on that and something that we can express and that's something people believe is achievable.
I think we might have time for one more quick question. This is from Kyla. How did you think about social desirability bias in analyzing the results? For example, I think people know that they're not supposed to trust information on social media, but it clearly penetrates.
I think that is another great question, Kyla. And I mean, handling social desirability bias is a challenge in any survey. It is one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in the work that we do at Change Research is that by eliminating the human interviewer and not really sort of think this group is like Northeast research, Midwest research, people didn't sort of know who, they're not trying to impress people when they take our surveys. And I feel like we have a little more of an honest response. I think what we need to study is, and we have some ideas about this that we're thinking about for the rest of this year, is how people showing something, a clip in the context of other things that people might see on TikTok or Instagram reels, and then testing that against like seeing the same content if it's surrounded by like a beer commercial and a car ad, and whether like what people respond to or what they remember from that is different based on the content that they're seeing around it. Because I think it's sort of, the more I've sort of thought about this, I think it's harder. It's going to be a harder thing to unpack. But like the Kamala's for they them thing that stuck in people's head, that was all from television ads that people saw in football games. So the stuff that catches on television is, I think, ultimately going to be stickier than what people see on social media or digitally. But we're at a point where no one's really going to see TV ads much anymore.
And I think, we probably don't have it. There's still some questions coming in, but we're running close to time. I guess, Melanie, do you feel like we have time for one more question, or?
I think we can take one more, and I sent out our exit poll. If you say you want to hear more from us or anything, we'll be sending follow-ups and can even be happy to talk to you more about this data. We'll be sending the slide deck and the recording as well. But one more question, Sumani.
Yeah, so Maxwell asks, kind of a two-parter, but can you explain elite persuasion again? And then also just historically what happens when paranoid thinking declines. It's, is it a period of reduced social stress or generational change?
Um, Again, another excellent question. Elite persuasion is just a phrase that I think I use to try to sound smart, but all it really means is that what Donald Trump or leaders say, like when they have a sort of very clear message, people follow that message. And elite persuasion is just basically like Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or people that have large followings say something, they can shape, they're best able to shape public opinion versus anyone else. And I just sort of thought about, like, we started this, I would say you could sort of see from that, like, elected officials care about me or don't care about me was very low in the late 50s. And I think when you see some of the other longer term trends about trust in federal government, it's the post-war period going through the 60s or right sort of before the height of the Vietnam War, when trust was at its highest. But that was also the time when Joe McCarthy was very prevalent in terms of the Red Scare and communism also happened during that period. So that there are times when it's like, when you look at the late 40s and 50s and the period right after the Second World War was when income inequality was the most balanced it's been, I think, when you sort of look at the last 100 years, that's when it was the most balanced. Trust in government was particularly high. The federal government was building interstate highways and spending lots of money because we were extremely prosperous. But there was also a time when paranoid thinking from Joe McCarthy could thrive. So there are going to be periods where, like, let's sort of say that it's prosperity, but like society did change after 1945. Like, we definitely had a break from the Great Depression, and then sort of the fight to fascism became the fight to communism. So there was a lot of uncertainty that came within that. But there can be periods of sort of like much less social strife. That's not even sort of period, not even getting into the period leading up to the Civil Rights Act, where conspiratorial thinking can also thrive. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I would say now, though, it's just sort of like it's really being driven at a very elite level. And you can already sort of see from how Gavin Newsom is running his campaign, as funny as it is trying to appeal to the same type of paranoid conspiratorial thinking to a completely different audience that is open to it as Trump's audience is.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. I know we're a little bit over time, so appreciate you all being here, and look forward to sending out the slide deck and the recording after this. Thanks again so much, and have a wonderful Friday.
Thank you, everyone.